The morning sun painted the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and crimson as Elena Vasquez stepped onto her front porch, coffee mug in hand. At 52, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to depend only on herself. Her weathered hands, scarred from years of ranch work and mountain hunting, wrapped around the warm ceramic as she surveyed her land. The Double V Ranch stretched across 3,000 acres of rugged terrain, bordered by dense pine forests and rocky cliffs that most people found intimidating. Elena found them comforting. This land had been in her family for 4 generations, passed down from her great-grandfather who had carved it out of the wilderness with nothing but determination and a sharp axe. 2 years had passed since her husband Miguel died in the truck accident on Highway 285. 2 years since the funeral where half the county had come to pay their respects to the man who had been known for his kindness and his skill with horses. 2 years since Elena had stood at his graveside, dry-eyed and determined, while whispered conversations floated around her about what would happen to the ranch now that she was alone. Most people assumed she would sell. A widow in her 50s trying to manage a cattle ranch and horse breeding operation single-handedly? It seemed impossible. The offers had started coming within weeks of Miguel's burial. Real estate developers, neighboring ranchers, even a mining company interested in the mineral rights. All of them spoke in gentle, sympathetic tones about how difficult it must be for her, how she deserved to rest after all her hard work. Elena had listened politely to each offer, then declined just as politely. This land was her blood, her bones, her breath. She would rather die than sell it. The cattle were already stirring in the near pasture, their morning lowing carried on the cool mountain air. Elena's border collie, Rex, emerged from the barn and trotted over to her side, his intelligent brown eyes alert and ready for the day's work. At 8 years old, Rex was getting gray around his muzzle, but he was still the best cattle dog in 3 counties. "Morning, boy," Elena murmured, scratching behind his ears. "Ready to check the herd?" Rex's tail wagged once, which was as demonstrative as he ever got. He was a working dog, serious about his responsibilities, much like his owner. Elena finished her coffee and went back inside to grab her rifle, ammunition, and the leather satchel that held her tracking supplies. The house felt too quiet sometimes, especially in the morning when Miguel used to fill it with his off-key humming and the sounds of breakfast preparation. She had learned to appreciate the silence, though. It made her more aware of the subtle sounds that warned of trouble, predators, or injured animals. The morning routine was sacred to Elena. Check the cattle, inspect the fences, monitor the horses, and scan for signs of the mountain lions that occasionally wandered down from the higher elevations. Mountain lions were a constant concern for ranchers in this area, but Elena had developed an unusual relationship with the big cats over the years. Most ranchers hired hunters or called the wildlife department when they had mountain lion problems. Elena handled them herself, and she did it without weapons. It had started as necessity when she was younger and couldn't afford to hire help. Her father had taught her to track, and her Apache grandmother had shared stories about communicating with wild animals through patience, respect, and understanding of their nature. The first time she had encountered a mountain lion on her property, she had been terrified. It was a young male, probably driven out of his mother's territory and searching for his own range. He had killed one of their calves, and Miguel had wanted to call on a hunter. Elena had asked for a chance to handle it herself. For 3 days, she had tracked the cat through the forest, learning his patterns, understanding his routes, and preferences. On the 4th day, she had found him resting in a grove of aspen trees, and instead of raising her rifle, she had sat down 50 yards away and simply waited. Hours passed. The mountain lion watched her with golden eyes, occasionally rising to pace, but never approaching or fleeing. Elena remained perfectly still, demonstrating through her posture and patience that she was not a threat but also not prey. She was simply another creature sharing the mountain. When the sun began to set, Elena had stood slowly, maintaining eye contact with the big cat, and backed away. The next morning, she found that the mountain lion had left her property, heading deeper into the national forest where deer were more plentiful and human conflict was less likely. Word of her unusual method had spread among the local ranching community, though most people assumed she was exaggerating or that luck had played a larger role than skill. Elena didn't mind the skepticism. She continued to handle mountain lion encounters her own way, and over the years, she had successfully redirected more than 24 cats away from her livestock without harming them. This morning felt different, though. Rex was more alert than usual, his head turning frequently toward the eastern pasture where the year-old calves grazed. Elena trusted the dog's instincts completely. If he sensed something unusual, there was definitely something worth investigating. They walked together toward the eastern pasture, Elena's boots crunching softly on the frost-covered grass. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of cattle and the whisper of wind through the pine trees. But as they crested a small hill, Elena spotted something that made her blood run cold. 4 men were standing near her prize breeding bull, Caesar, examining the massive Angus with the calculating eyes of thieves evaluating merchandise. They wore heavy coats and, well, caps, and Elena could see the outline of weapons beneath their jackets. Their truck was parked behind a grove of trees, hidden from view of the main house. Cattle rustling had been a problem in the area lately. 3 neighboring ranches had lost animals over the past 6 months, and the local sheriff's department was stretched too thin to provide adequate protection for the scattered rural properties. Most of the thefts had occurred at night, but these men were bold enough to scout in broad daylight. Elena's hand moved instinctively to the rifle slung across her back, but she forced herself to remain calm. 4 against 1 were not good odds, especially if they were armed and experienced. She needed to assess the situation more carefully before deciding how to respond. She and Rex backed down below the ridge line, and Elena pulled out her binoculars to get a better look at the intruders. The men were in their 30s and 40s, with the hard, lean look of people who made their living through violence. Their leader appeared to be a tall man with a graying beard and a scar across his left cheek. He was pointing at different groups of cattle and speaking in low tones to his companions. Elena's jaw clenched as she watched them evaluate her animals like items in a catalog. Caesar alone was worth $15,000, and the pregnant cows they were eyeing represented years of careful breeding and investment. This wasn't just theft. It was an attack on everything she and Miguel had built together. Rex pressed against her leg, sensing her tension. Elena forced herself to breathe slowly and think strategically. She could retreat to the house and call the sheriff, but the nearest deputy was 30 minutes away, and these men could load up her cattle and disappear long before help arrived. She could try to confront them directly, but that would likely end with her being overpowered or worse. Or she could use the skills that made her reputation in these mountains. Elena had been hunting and tracking in this terrain since she was 12 years old. She knew every rock, every tree, every hidden trail, and natural blind. These strangers were in her domain now, and they had no idea what they were dealing with. She spent the next hour moving carefully through the forest, using deer paths and natural cover to circle around behind the rustlers. Her grandmother's lessons echoed in her mind: patience, observation, understanding of the environment. The same principles that worked with mountain lions could work with human predators. By the time the sun reached its peak, Elena had identified the men's truck, their planned escape route, and their general timeline. They were planning to move the cattle that evening, probably expecting to work under cover of darkness. They had even brought a portable trailer, hidden in a ravine about a half-mile from the main herd. But Elena also noticed something else. The scarred leader kept looking toward the tree line, his hand resting near his weapon. These are not amateur thieves. They were professionals, possibly part of the organized, rustling ring that had been plaguing the region. They expected trouble, and they were prepared to deal with it violently. As the afternoon wore on, Elena developed her plan. She couldn't outfight 4 armed men, but she could outthink them. The same patience and psychological understanding that allowed her to redirect mountain lions could be applied to human predators. Fear was a powerful weapon, especially when used by someone who understood the landscape and could move through it like a ghost. By evening, the rustlers had returned to their truck to wait for darkness. Elena used the time to prepare her supplies. Rope, her grandfather's hunting knife, flares from the emergency kit in her truck, and several items from her mountain lion tracking kit. She also took the time to move Caesar and the most valuable cattle into a pasture closer to the house, using Rex to quietly guide them away from the rustlers' planned target area. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges, Elena positioned herself in the forest overlooking the rustlers' camp. She had changed into dark clothing and carried minimal equipment to ensure silent movement. Rex remained at the house on her command, though she could see his silhouette in the window, watching and waiting. The rustlers made their first mistake when they built a small fire to warm themselves while they waited. The flames destroyed their night vision and created a beacon that allowed Elena to track their exact location. Their second mistake was underestimating the woman whose land they were planning to steal. Elena had learned patience from hunting mountain lions, but she had also learned that sometimes the most effective approach was to remind predators that they were not the only dangerous creatures in the mountains. These men had come to her land believing they could take what they wanted without consequences. It was time to teach them otherwise. The first phase of Elena's plan began just after full darkness fell. Moving like a shadow through the forest she knew better than her own house, she approached the rustlers' hidden trailer. Using her knife, she quietly slashed 2 of the tires and cut the electrical connection to the trailer lights. Without the trailer, they couldn't transport her cattle, and the damaged wiring would make it impossible to fix quickly. Next, she moved to their truck. Elena had learned long ago that psychological pressure was often more effective than direct confrontation. She placed a small pile of stones in a specific pattern near the driver's door, then scratched a symbol into the dirt nearby. To most people, it would look random, but to someone familiar with local folklore, it resembled the territorial markings used by mountain cats. The third part of her plan was the most dangerous. Elena needed to get close enough to the rustlers' camp to leave additional signs without being detected. She had done this dozens of times while tracking actual mountain lions, but the stakes had never been this high. She approached from downwind, moving in the slow, careful manner her father had taught her for stalking deer. Every step was placed deliberately, every breath controlled. The rustlers were talking in low voices around their fire, confident in their isolation and planning their approach to the cattle. Elena got close enough to hear their conversation, and what she heard made her blood boil. They were not just planning to steal her cattle. They were discussing what to do about the old woman if she interfered. The scarred leader spoke casually about burning down the house to eliminate any witnesses, while another man suggested more direct methods. These were not desperate thieves driven by poverty. They were predators who viewed Elena as an obstacle to be eliminated. The realization crystallized her resolve. She was not just defending her property anymore. She was fighting for her life. Moving with extreme care, Elena placed more territorial markings around their camp. She hung small bundles of fur and feathers from tree branches, arranged stones in patterns that suggested animal presence, and used her knife to create claw marks in the bark of nearby trees. To anyone familiar with mountain lion behavior, the signs would suggest a large, aggressive cat was claiming this territory. But Elena's masterstroke came when she found the perfect vantage point above their camp. Using a technique her Apache grandmother had taught her, she cupped her hands around her mouth and produced a sound that was part scream, part growl, and entirely terrifying. The noise echoed off the canyon walls, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. The effect on the rustlers was immediate. They jumped to their feet, weapons drawn, staring into the darkness around them. The scarred leader barked orders to spread out and search the area, but Elena was already moving, using their confusion to slip deeper into the forest. Over the next hour, she repeated the performance from different locations, sometimes adding the sound of breaking branches or rolling rocks to suggest a large predator moving through the undergrowth. Each time, the rustlers grew more nervous, their movements becoming erratic, and their discipline breaking down. By midnight, the psychological pressure was taking its toll. Elena could hear arguments breaking out among the men as they debated whether to continue with their plan or abandon it. The scarred leader was insisting they proceed, but his companions were clearly spooked by the increasingly aggressive presence that seemed to be stalking them. Elena's final move came when she spotted one of the rustlers moving alone through the forest, apparently trying to locate the source of the sounds. She followed him at a distance until he stopped to rest against a large pine tree. Then, moving with the silence of a hunting cat, she approached from behind. The man never knew what hit him. Elena's arm snaked around his throat, applying pressure to the carotid artery in a technique she had learned from self-defense course years earlier. He lost consciousness within seconds, and Elena quickly bound his hands and feet with rope, then dragged him deeper into the forest where his companions wouldn't find him easily. When a man woke up hours later, he found himself tied to a tree with more territorial markings scattered around him and the distant sound of something large moving through the undergrowth. Elena had positioned herself where she could observe his reactions while remaining hidden, and she was satisfied to see genuine terror in his eyes. The psychological warfare was working. By dawn, the remaining 3 rustlers had given up any pretense of stealth and were shouting for their missing companion while making increasingly desperate plans to leave. The discovery of their sabotage truck and trailer only increased their panic. Elena watched from her hiding place as the men struggled to change the slashed tires and repair the electrical damage. Their leader was furious, screaming at his subordinates and waving his gun around in a way that suggested he was close to losing control entirely. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows through the forest, Elena prepared for the final phase of her plan. She had successfully defended her cattle and proven that her land was not an easy target, but she needed to ensure these men would not return. More importantly, she needed to send a message to whoever was organizing these thefts that the Double V Ranch was under the protection of something far more dangerous than an isolated widow. The rustlers never saw her coming. Moving with the fluid grace of a lifetime predator, Elena emerged from the forest like something out of their worst nightmares, her face streaked with dirt and her eyes burning with the cold fury of someone defending her home. The psychological pressure of the long night had broken their resistance, and when confronted by the reality of the woman who had been stalking them, they simply ran. They abandoned their trailer, left their bound companion tied to the tree, and fled in their damaged truck without looking back. Elena stood in her pasture, watching the dust cloud of their retreat disappear down the valley road. Rex appeared at her side, having sensed that the danger had passed, and together they walked back toward the house as the morning sun climbed higher over the mountains. The phone call to Sheriff Martinez was brief and matter-of-fact. Elena reported the attempted cattle theft, provided the location of the abandoned trailer and the tied-up rustler, and mentioned that she had some tire marks and license plate information that might help with the investigation. She didn't mention the mountain lion signs, the psychological warfare, or the way she had stalked armed men through the forest like a hunting cat. Some stories were better left untold, especially when they might strain the credibility of a simple widow trying to protect a ranch. But word would spread, as it always did in rural communities. Stories would be embellished, and details would be added with each telling. Soon, every cattle rustler and would-be thief in 3 states would know about the widow who hunted mountain lions with her bare hands and who had made for armed men flee into the night like frightened children. Elena didn't mind the stories. In fact, she encouraged them. A reputation for being dangerous was often more effective than actual weapons when it came to protecting isolated property. And if people wanted to believe that she had supernatural abilities or an unnatural connection to the mountain lions that roamed her land, that was fine with her. The truth was simpler and perhaps more impressive. She was a woman who understood her environment, who had learned to think like a predator, and who refused to be driven from the land that was rightfully hers. The mountains had taught her patience, observation, and respect for the natural balance between predator and prey. Now, she had applied those lessons to human predators, and the results spoke for themselves. 3 weeks had passed since the cattle rustlers fled Elena's property, and the story of their encounter had already grown into legend. At Morrison's General Store, old-timers spoke in hushed tones about how Elena Vasquez had single-handedly defeated 4 armed men using nothing but her knowledge of mountain lion behavior. Some versions had her actually calling real mountain lions to her aid, while others claimed she could transform into one herself under the full moon. Elena listened to these stories with quiet amusement when she made her weekly trip to town for supplies. She never corrected the exaggerations or added details to fuel the gossip. A reputation for being dangerous was useful protection for a woman living alone on an isolated ranch, and she had learned long ago that mystery was often more powerful than truth. But the stories had attracted unwanted attention. 3 days earlier, a black SUV with tinted windows had driven slowly past her property, the occupants clearly studying her layout and security measures. Yesterday, she had found boot prints near her barn that didn't belong to any of her regular visitors. Someone was watching her, and Elena's instincts told her that the rustling attempt had been connected to something larger and more dangerous. The confirmation came on a Tuesday morning when Sheriff Martinez drove up her long gravel driveway, his expression grim and his usual friendly demeanor replaced by professional concern. Elena met him on the front porch, coffee cup in hand, and Rex at her side. "Morning, Elena," Martinez said, removing his hat as he climbed the porch steps. "We need to talk." Elena nodded toward the rocking chairs Miguel had built from local pine. "Sounds serious." Martinez settled into the chair with a heavy sigh. At 62, he had been sheriff of this county for 15 years, and Elena could see the weight of difficult news in his weathered features. "The FBI came to see me yesterday. Turns out those rustlers you ran off weren't just opportunistic thieves." "I figured as much," Elena said, taking a seat beside him. "They were too organized, too professional. They're part of a much bigger operation," Martinez continued. "Multi-state cattle theft ring, but that's not the worst of it. The Bureau says they're also involved in money laundering for some very dangerous people. Drug cartel money, mostly, but also arms dealers and human traffickers." Elena felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "So by stopping them here, I made myself a target." "That's what the FBI thinks," Martinez confirmed. "The man you left tied to the tree? His name is Danny Kovac, and he's already talking. Seems your little psychological warfare session left quite an impression. He's convinced you've got some kind of supernatural protection." Elena allowed herself a small smile. "Good. Fear is a powerful deterrent." "Elena, this isn't a joke," Martinez said, leaning forward in his chair. "The people behind this operation don't just steal cattle. They've killed at least 6 ranchers in 4 states over the past 2 years. Anyone who interferes with their business tends to disappear permanently." The gravity of the situation settled over Elena like a heavy blanket. She had known the rustlers were dangerous, but she hadn't considered the possibility that they were connected to organized crime. Her successful defense of her property hadn't just protected her cattle. It had potentially signed her death warrant. "What does the FBI recommend?" she asked. Martinez pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "Agent Sarah Chun wants to meet with you. They're offering witness protection if you're willing to testify against the people you can identify." Elena looked at the card, then back at Martinez. "Witness protection means leaving the ranch." "Yes. Never coming back." "Probably not." Elena stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the land that had been in her family for 4 generations. The morning sun was painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, and she could see Caesar grazing peacefully in the near pasture, unaware of the danger his presence had triggered. "I'm not leaving," she said finally. Martinez had expected this response, but he tried anyway. "Elena, these people don't make idle threats. If they've decided you're a problem, they'll send professionals to deal with you. This isn't like handling mountain lions. These are trained killers with military-grade weapons." "This is my land," Elena replied, her voice carrying the quiet strength of absolute conviction. "My family built this place with their own hands. My husband is buried in that cemetery behind the house. I'm not running from criminals who think they can intimidate me into abandoning everything I care about." Martinez stood up and joined her at the railing. "I understand how you feel, but do you?" Elena interrupted, turned to face him. "Your family has lived in town for 20 years. When you retire, you'll move to Phoenix or Florida like every other retired cop. This ranch is my identity, Sheriff. Without it, I'm nothing. Without it, you're alive," Martinez countered. "Dead heroes don't protect anything." Elena was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. Rex seemed to sense her inner turmoil and pressed against her leg, offering silent support. Finally, she spoke. "How long do I have before they come?" "Agent Chun thinks maybe a week, possibly less." Danny Kovac gave them enough information to know that the organization is planning retaliation. They've already moved against 2 other witnesses in this case. "What happened to them?" Martinez's expression darkened. "You don't want to know." Elena nodded grimly. "I need time to prepare." "Elena, you can't fight an entire criminal organization by yourself. This isn't about being brave or stubborn. This is about survival." "I've been surviving on this mountain for 52 years, Elena replied. "I've faced droughts, blizzards, predators, and every other challenge this land could throw at me. I'm not about to let some city criminals drive me away." Martinez recognized the futility of arguing further. He had known Elena for 15 years, and once she made up her mind about something, no amount of reasoning would change it. "If you won't leave, then at least let me help. I can station a deputy here, maybe set up some surveillance equipment." "No," Elena said firmly. Deputies and surveillance equipment would just give them targets to eliminate before they come after me. Besides, your people aren't trained for this kind of warfare. And you are? Elena smiled, but there was no humor in it. I've spent 30 years learning to think like a predator, Sheriff. The only difference between a mountain lion and a hired killer is that the mountain lion is honest about what is. After Martinez left, Elena spent the rest of the morning walking her property with Rex, studying the terrain with new eyes. She had always known every tree, rock, and trail on her land, but now she was evaluating them as potential defensive positions, escape routes, and ambush sites. The Double V Ranch was ideally situated for the kind of guerrilla warfare she was contemplating. The main house sat on a small hill overlooking 3 separate valleys, with clear sight lines in all directions. Dense forest provided cover and concealment within 50 yards of the buildings, and the rocky terrain would make vehicle access difficult except along predetermined routes. More importantly, Elena knew this land in ways that no visitor ever could. She could move through the forest in complete darkness without making a sound. She knew which rocks would hold her weight and which would shift underfoot. She could predict wind patterns, identify approaching weather, and find water sources that weren't marked on any map. Her first task was to create early warning systems. Elena spent the afternoon setting up a series of simple but effective perimeter alarms using fishing line, empty cans, and small bells. Anyone approaching the house from any direction would trigger at least one of these devices, giving her advance notice of their presence. Next, she prepared concealed supply caches at strategic locations around the property. Each cache contained water, ammunition, basic medical supplies, and high-energy food. If she had to abandon the house, she could survive in the mountains for weeks using these hidden resources. Elena's most important preparation, however, was psychological. She had successfully used fear as a weapon against the cattle rustlers, but professional killers would be much harder to intimidate. She needed to become something more terrifying than they were, something that would strike at their deepest fears and superstitions. That evening, Elena sat in Miguel's old workshop, surrounded by tools and material she had gathered throughout the day. Using leather, bones, fur, and feathers collected during her years of hunting and tracking, she began creating totems and markers that would suggest the presence of something supernatural protecting her land. Some were based on authentic Native American spiritual symbols her grandmother had taught her, while others were her own creation, designed to look ancient and mysterious to anyone unfamiliar with local tribal traditions. The goal was to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of her attackers, to make them question whether they were dealing with an ordinary woman or something far more dangerous. As she worked, Elena found herself thinking about the mountain lions that still roamed the higher elevations of her property. She hadn't encountered any for several months, but she knew they were there, watching and waiting as they always did. Perhaps it was time to renew those old relationships. The next morning, Elena began preparing for the most dangerous hunt of her life. She packed her grandfather's hunting knife, rope, dried meat, and the tracking supplies she used for following mountain lions. But instead of hunting the big cats, she was going to seek them out for a very different purpose. Elena had always believed that the mountain lions tolerated her presence on their territory because she showed them proper respect and never posed a threat to their survival. Over the years, she had developed an intuitive understanding of their behavior patterns, territorial boundaries, and communication methods. Now, she was going to put that relationship to the ultimate test. The hike to the upper elevations took most of the day. Elena followed deer trails and natural corridors she had used dozens of times before, but now she moved with the specific intention of entering active mountain lion territory. She was looking for a mature female named Silver, so called because of her unusual pale coat, who had been using this area as her primary hunting ground for the past 3 years. Elena had encountered Silver on multiple occasions, always maintaining respectful distance while observing the cat's habits and preferences. Silver was an experienced hunter with 2 adolescent cubs, territorial but not unnecessarily aggressive, and intelligent enough to recognize Elena as a non-threatening presence. Finding Silver required patience and careful reading of signs. Elena looked for scratch marks on trees, scent markings, and the remains of recent kills. Mountain lions were creatures of habit, using the same trails and resting spots repeatedly, and Elena had memorized Silver's preferred routes during their previous encounters. She found the big cat just before sunset, resting on a rocky outcrop overlooking a small clearing where deer often grazed. Silver was magnificent, nearly 8 feet long from nose to tail tip, and probably weighing close to 140 pounds. Her pale coat seemed to glow in the fading light, and her golden eyes tracked Elena's approach with calm alertness. Elena stopped 50 yards away and sat down on a fallen log, making no sudden movements that might be interpreted as threatening. She had brought offerings, pieces of deer meat from her last successful hunt, which she placed on the ground between them before retreating to her original position. For the next hour, woman and mountain lion observed each other in the growing darkness. Elena had done this before, but never with such a specific purpose in mind. She was seeking an alliance, a mutual understanding that would benefit them both when the human predators arrived. Slowly, carefully, Elena began to speak in the low, calm tone she had always used when encountering mountain lions. She explained her situation, describing the threat to her land and her need for the kind of help that only the true owners of these mountains could provide. To any observer, it would have looked like madness, a woman talking to a wild predator as if it could understand human language and respond to requests for assistance. But Elena had spent decades studying animal behavior, and she knew that communication involved much more than words. Her posture, her tone of voice, her scent, and her overall energy all conveyed information to the big cat. She was demonstrating respect for Silver's territory while also projecting confidence and determination. She was establishing herself as an ally rather than a threat, someone whose presence might actually benefit the mountain lion's own survival. Silver eventually approached the meat offerings, never taking her eyes off Elena, but showing no signs of fear or aggression. She accepted the gift, then retreated to her original position to consume it. The gesture was significant. By accepting food from Elena's hands, Silver was acknowledging a relationship that went beyond simple tolerance. Elena spent the night on the mountain, sleeping fitfully in a natural shelter formed by fallen rocks. Silver and her cubs remained in the area, occasionally visible in the moonlight as they moved through their territory. The message was clear. Elena was welcome here, accepted as part of the ecosystem rather than an intruder. When she returned to the ranch the next morning, Elena felt more confident about her chances of survival. She wasn't just preparing to face human predators alone. She was aligning herself with the natural guardians of this mountain. The psychological effect on her attackers might be minimal, but the practical advantages could be significant. Mountain lions were expert stalkers, capable of moving through dense forest without making a sound. They were ambush predators, patient and opportunistic, striking only when they had every advantage. Most importantly, they were territorial, protective of their domain against any perceived threat. Elena spent the rest of the week completing her preparations. She created more territorial markers and mysterious signs, positioned them throughout the approaches to her property, and established observation posts where she could monitor multiple access routes simultaneously. She also practiced moving through her land at night, relearning familiar trails by touch and sound rather than sight. Professional killers would probably approach under cover of darkness, and Elena needed to be able to match their stealth while maintaining every possible advantage. On Friday evening, exactly 1 week after Sheriff Martinez had warned her about the threat, Elena's perimeter alarms began ringing. Someone was approaching her property from the east, moving slowly and carefully, but triggering the fishing line sensors she had placed along the forest edge. Elena had been expecting this moment, but her heart still raced as she grabbed her rifle and moved to the observation post she had prepared overlooking the eastern approach. Through her binoculars, she could see 3 figures in dark clothing moving through the trees with military precision. These were not the desperate cattle rustlers she had faced before. These were professionals, armed with sophisticated weapons and equipped for a surgical strike. They moved like a coordinated team, communicating through hand signals and maintaining strict fire discipline. Elena watched them for 20 minutes, studying their tactics and trying to identify their leader. They were good, probably former military or law enforcement, but they were operating in unfamiliar territory against an opponent who knew every advantage the landscape could provide. More importantly, they had no idea what they were really facing. To them, Elena was just another target to be eliminated, a widow whose stubbornness had made her inconvenient to their organization. They expected to find a frightened woman hiding in her house, not a predator who had spent decades learning to hunt in these mountains. As the assassins approached the house, Elena began implementing the psychological warfare tactics that had worked so effectively against the cattle rustlers. But this time, she had additional allies moving through the darkness around her property. Silver and her cubs were hunting tonight, drawn by the scent of strangers in their territory and the subtle signals Elena had been leaving for the past week. The mountain lions wouldn't attack humans under normal circumstances, but their presence alone would add to the atmosphere of menace and supernatural threat that Elena was trying to create. The first phase of Elena's defense was about to begin, and she found herself thinking of her Apache grandmother's stories about warriors who could call upon the spirits of the mountain to protect their homes. Tonight, those stories would become reality as woman and wild predator joined forces to defend the land they both called home. The three assassins moved through Elena's property with deadly precision, their military training evident in every calculated step. Through her binoculars, Elena identified them as professionals, each carrying high-end tactical gear and communicating through nearly invisible hand signals. Their leader was a tall, lean man with the fluid movements of someone accustomed to lethal violence. The other two flanked him at precise intervals, covering multiple angles of approach. Elena had positioned herself in a rocky outcrop 60 yards from her house, a natural blind that provided excellent visibility while keeping her hidden from view. Rex crouched beside her, his ears pricked forward and his body tense with awareness of the intruders. She had trained him to remain completely silent during hunting expeditions, and tonight that training might save both their lives. The assassins paused at the edge of the cleared area around Elena's house, studying the building for signs of life and planning their final approach. Elena could see the red glow of infrared scopes as they scanned windows and doorways, looking for heat signatures that would reveal her location. They would find nothing. Elena had spent the afternoon preparing the house to appear occupied while actually being empty. Lights on timers created the illusion of normal evening activity, while a heating pad positioned near the living room window provided the heat signature of someone watching television. She had even recorded herself moving around the house, playing the sounds through speakers connected to motion sensors. The psychological preparation Elena had spent days implementing was already taking effect. The territorial markings she had placed throughout the forest were subtle, but unmistakable to anyone familiar with predator behavior. Scratch marks on trees, carefully arranged bones and stones, and the lingering scent of big cats created an atmosphere of menace that even trained killers would notice subconsciously. More importantly, Silver and her cubs were active tonight. Elena could see their pale forms moving through the shadows beyond the assassin's position, drawn by curiosity and territorial instinct. The mountain lions weren't hunting humans, but their presence added to the sense that this place was claimed by something wild and dangerous. The assassin's leader made a fatal error in judgment. Instead of maintaining their coordinated approach, he split his team to surround the house, probably thinking they were dealing with an ordinary victim who would try to barricade herself inside. This division of force was exactly what Elena had been hoping for. She watched as the three men moved to positions around her house, each taking responsibility for a different section of the perimeter. They were good, maintaining sight lines and communication, but they were also isolated from each other in terrain they didn't understand. Elena had been preparing for this moment her entire adult life, though she hadn't realized it until now. Every hunting expedition, every encounter with mountain lions, every night spent moving through these forests had been training for this ultimate test of survival. She began her counterattack by targeting the youngest of the three assassins, a man who appeared to be in his 20s and whose movements suggested less experience than his companions. He had positioned himself near the barn, probably planning to provide overwatch while his teammates approached the house. Elena's approach was pure mountain lion, using every natural feature for concealment while moving with absolute silence. She had learned this stalking technique by observing Silver and other big cats, understanding how they use shadows, wind direction, and natural cover to become invisible even in open terrain. The young assassin never knew what hit him. Elena emerged from the darkness behind him like a nightmare given form, her grandfather's hunting knife sliding between his ribs and into his heart before he could cry out or raise his weapon. She lowered his body silently to the ground, then took his radio and tactical gear. One down, two to go. Elena's next target was positioned on the far side of the house, crouched behind a woodpile that provided excellent cover from a building, but left him exposed to attack from the forest. This man was older, more experienced, and Elena would need to use different tactics to eliminate him. Instead of a direct approach, she used the mountain lion's own hunting strategy, patience, and misdirection. Elena positioned herself where she could observe the assassin while remaining completely hidden, then began making subtle noises that suggested movement in different directions. A branch breaking here, a stone rolling there, the whisper of fabric against bark. Each sound was carefully calculated to make the assassin turn his attention away from his primary target, while never quite revealing Elena's actual location. Mountain lions were masters of this technique, creating false trails and phantom movements that confuse their prey until the moment of attack. Elena had observed this behavior dozens of times, and now she applied those lessons to human hunting. After 20 minutes of psychological pressure, the assassin was noticeably agitated. His movements became less disciplined, his head turning constantly as he tried to identify the source of the sounds that seemed to surround him. When a particularly loud crack echoed from his left side, he made the mistake of leaving his position to investigate. Elena was waiting for him in the darkness between two large pine trees, using their trunks as concealment until he passed within arm's reach. This time she used a chokehold rather than the knife, applying pressure to his carotid artery until he lost consciousness, then finishing him quietly with the blade. 2 down, 1 to go. The team leader was the most dangerous of the three, experienced and disciplined enough to maintain his position despite the loss of radio contact with his subordinates. Elena could see him through her binoculars, crouched near the front porch and scanning the darkness with professional intensity. This man would not be defeated by simple stalking techniques. He was too experienced, too alert, and too well-positioned for a direct approach. Elena needed to use her most advanced psychological warfare techniques, the same methods that had allowed her to redirect mountain lions without violence. She began by placing the bodies of his dead teammates where he would eventually discover them, positioning them in ways that suggested animal predation rather than human violence. Scratch marks around the wounds, torn clothing, and small amounts of fur strategically placed nearby created the impression that something large and predatory had killed his companions. Next, Elena used the radio she had taken from the first victim to play sounds of distress and confusion, transmitting brief bursts of static mixed with what could have been screams or growls. The effect was designed to suggest that his team had encountered something beyond their understanding or training. But Elena's masterstroke involved Silver herself. Using techniques her grandmother had taught her for communicating with wild animals, Elena positioned herself upwind from the mountain lion and began producing the low, guttural sounds that big cats use to establish territorial claims. Silver's response was immediate and terrifying. The big cat emerged from the forest at the edge of the cleared area, her pale coat ghostly in the moonlight, and began stalking toward the house with the fluid grace of an apex predator. Her cubs followed at a distance, adding to the impression of a hunting pack closing in on their prey. The team leader's discipline finally cracked when he saw Silver approaching. Professional killers were trained to deal with human threats, but facing a wild predator in its natural territory triggered ancient fears that no amount of military conditioning could overcome. Elena watched as the man raised his rifle towards Silver, then hesitated, probably realizing that gunfire would reveal his position to whatever had killed his teammates. In that moment of uncertainty, Elena struck. She had circled around behind him during the confusion, using Silver's presence as a distraction to close the distance undetected. When the assassin finally sensed her approach and began to turn, it was already too late. Elena's knife found the gap between his body armor plates, sliding up under his ribs and into his heart with the precision born of decades handling hunting knives. He collapsed without a sound, his weapon clattering uselessly to the wooden porch. 3 down, threat eliminated. Silver paused at the edge of the porch, her golden eyes meeting Elena's in a moment of perfect understanding. The mountain lion had played her part in this deadly theater, helping to eliminate a threat to their shared territory. With a soft chuff of acknowledgement, Silver melted back into the forest with her cubs, disappearing as silently as she had arrived. Elena spent the next hour cleaning up the aftermath of the battle. She searched the bodies for identification, finding nothing but sophisticated equipment and burner phones with no stored contacts. These had been professional ghosts, hired killers with no official existence or traceable connections to their employers. The bodies themselves presented a disposal problem. Elena couldn't simply call Sheriff Martinez and report killing 3 assassins on her property. The legal complications would be enormous, and there was no guarantee that the criminal organization wouldn't send more killers while she was tied up in court proceedings. Instead, Elena decided to make the 3 men disappear as completely as they had intended to make her disappear. The Rocky Mountains were full of deep ravines, hidden caves, and places where bodies might never be found. More importantly, the complete disappearance of the assassination team would send a powerful message to whoever had hired them. Elena loaded the first body onto the 4-wheeler she used for checking remote sections of her property. The nearest disposal site was a natural sinkhole about 2 miles into the national forest, a limestone cavity that dropped nearly 100 feet into an underground river system. Local legends claimed the sinkhole was cursed, that it was home to spirits that dragged unwary travelers into the depths. Elena had always dismissed such stories as folklore, but tonight she found them oddly appropriate. These men had come to her land as predators, and they would feed the mountain spirits that her grandmother's people had feared and respected. The trip to the sinkhole took an hour round trip, time Elena used to think about the implications of what had just occurred. She had successfully defended her property against professional killers, but this victory would only escalate the conflict. The criminal organization would eventually realize that their assassination team had failed, and they would send more men with better equipment and different tactics. Elena was under no illusions about her long-term survival prospects. She had won this battle through superior knowledge of the terrain, careful preparation, and the element of surprise. Those advantages would diminish with each subsequent attack, especially if her enemies learned from their failures and adapted their approach. But she had also accomplished something more important than mere survival. She had demonstrated that the Double V Ranch was not an easy target, that attacking her property carried a high cost in both personnel and prestige. Criminal organizations were businesses, and businesses eventually abandoned ventures that proved unprofitable. More importantly, she had proven to herself that she was capable of protecting what mattered most to her. The land that held 4 generations of her family's history, the animals that depended on her care, the way of life that defined her identity as a woman and as a rancher. These things were worth fighting for, worth killing for, worth dying for if necessary. By dawn, Elena had disposed of all 3 bodies and cleaned every trace of blood from her property. She burned the assassin's equipment in her fireplace, scattering the ashes across her vegetable garden where they would fertilize next spring's crops. Their weapons she disassembled and buried in different locations, keeping only the ammunition that matched her own rifles. Sheriff Martinez arrived just after sunrise, as Elena had known he would. News of the missing FBI witnesses had reached his office overnight, and he was making rounds to check on potential targets. Elena met him on the front porch with coffee and fresh biscuits, looking exactly like a woman who had spent a quiet night at home. "Everything all right out here?" Martinez asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "We had some reports of unusual activity in the area last night." "Such as?" Elena inquired, settling into her rocking chair with perfect composure. "Motion sensors triggered at 3 different locations, but when deputies responded, they found nothing. Could have been deer, but the timing was suspicious." Elena nodded hashfully. "I heard some commotion around midnight, but it sounded like animals. Probably that mountain lion family that's been denning in the upper canyon. They've been more active lately." Martinez studied her face carefully, looking for any sign of deception or distress. Elena met his gaze steadily, projecting nothing but mild concern for the safety of her neighbors. "Elena, I'm going to ask you directly. Have you had any contact with suspicious individuals in the past few days?" "No, Sheriff. It's been very quiet out here." Martinez finished his coffee in thoughtful silence. He was an experienced lawman with good instincts, and something about Elena's perfect composure made him suspicious. But he also knew her well enough to understand that direct questioning would yield nothing if she had decided to keep information to herself. "You know, you can call me anytime if you feel threatened or unsafe," he said finally. Day or night, we'll respond as fast as we can. I appreciate that, Elena replied. But I feel very safe here. This land has been in my family for 4 generations, and it's always protected those who belong to it. After Martinez left, Elena walked her property one final time, checking for any evidence she might have missed. She found nothing out of place, no signs that 3 professional killers had died on her land just hours earlier. To any observer, the Double V Ranch looked exactly as it always had, peaceful, well-maintained, and completely under control. But Elena knew that appearances could be deceiving. She had learned that lesson from the mountain lions that haunted these forests, creatures that appeared calm and harmless until the moment they revealed their true nature. Tonight she had revealed her own true nature, and the knowledge of what she was capable of would either protect her or damn her in the days to come. Rex appeared at her side as she completed her patrol, his intelligent brown eyes reflecting an understanding that went beyond normal canine comprehension. He had witnessed the events of the night, had smelled the blood and fear and death, and he had accepted Elena's actions as necessary for the protection of their territory. Together, they stood on the hill overlooking the ranch as the sun climbed higher over the mountains, casting long shadows across the land that had become a battlefield. Elena felt no regret for the lives she had taken, no guilt for the violence she had unleashed. She had protected what was hers, and that was the most fundamental law of survival in the wilderness. The question now was whether her enemies would learn from this lesson, or whether they would continue to underestimate the woman who hunted mountain lions with her bare hands, and who had just proven that human predators were no more challenging than the 4-legged variety. Elena hoped they would be smart enough to leave her alone, but she was prepared for the possibility that they would escalate the conflict even further. If more killers came to her mountain, they would find the same reception as their predecessors, swift, silent, and absolutely fatal. The Double V Ranch had claimed 3 more lives in defense of its territory, and Elena Vasquez had proven once again that she was the most dangerous predator in these mountains. 2 months had passed since the 3 assassins vanished on Elena's property, and the criminal organization behind the cattle rustling operation was growing increasingly frustrated. The complete disappearance of their professional killers had sent shockwaves through their ranks, creating a crisis of confidence that threatened their entire regional operation. Elena learned about their internal struggles through an unexpected source: Danny Kovac, the cattle rustler she had left tied to a tree during the original raid. Kovac had become a federal informant in exchange for witness protection, and FBI agent Sarah Chun had started sharing selected intelligence with Elena as both a courtesy and a strategic necessity. The information painted a disturbing picture. The criminal organization was much larger than anyone had initially suspected, with connections to Mexican cartels, Eastern European arms dealers, and corrupt officials in multiple states. The cattle rustling had been just one small part of a money laundering operation that involved millions of dollars in illegal profits. Elena's successful defense of her property had become a symbol of resistance that was inspiring other ranchers to fight back instead of quietly accepting their losses. 3 neighboring properties had successfully repelled rustling attempts in the past month, using tactics inspired by stories of Elena's mountain lion methods. But the organization was adapting to this new resistance. Instead of sending small teams of cattle thieves or professional assassins, they were preparing for what amounted to a small war. Agent Chin's intelligence suggested that they were planning to make an example of Elena that would terrify other potential resistors back into submission. Elena received this news on a cold February morning while sitting in Sheriff Martinez's office, reviewing photographs of the weapons and personnel that surveillance teams had identified moving toward her region. The images were sobering: military-grade assault rifles, explosive devices, and at least 12 men with combat experience. "They're not planning to just kill you," Agent Chin explained, her professional demeanor unable to completely hide her concern. "They want to make a statement. Burn your buildings, slaughter your animals, leave evidence that will serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider interfering with their operations." Elena studied the photographs with the same calm attention she brought to tracking mountain lions. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford, and panic would only cloud her judgment when clear thinking was essential for survival. "When?" she asked simply. "Our best estimate is sometime in the next week," Chin replied. "They're staging in Nevada, probably planning to cross into Colorado under cover of a winter storm that's forecast for this weekend." Sheriff Martinez leaned forward in his chair. Elena, you cannot fight 12 armed men by yourself. This isn't about courage or stubbornness anymore. This is about accepting reality. What's the FBI prepared to offer? Elena asked, ignoring Martinez's plea. Agent Chun pulled out a thick folder. Complete witness protection, new identity, relocation to a state where the organization has no presence, financial support while you establish a new life. In exchange, you testify against everyone we can identify and help us dismantle their entire network. Elena looked through the paperwork, reading the details of the government's offer. It was generous, even thoughtful. The FBI had clearly done their research, identifying locations where a former rancher might find meaningful work and communities where she could rebuild her life. But the offer also represented the death of Elena Vasquez as completely as any bullet. The woman who had spent her life on this mountain, who had learned to communicate with wild predators, who had defended her ancestral land against human threats, would cease to exist. In her place would be someone new, someone safe, someone anonymous, and powerless. I need time to consider this, Elena said finally. Agent Chen nodded. You have 48 hours. After that, we can't guarantee your safety even if you change your mind. Elena drove home in thoughtful silence, Rex sitting in the passenger seat with the patient alertness of a dog who understood that important decisions were being made. The February landscape was stark and beautiful, snow-covered peaks rising against a crystalline blue sky that promised more cold weather ahead. The ranch looked peaceful in the afternoon light, with Caesar and the other cattle moving slowly through the snow-covered pasture and smoke rising from the chimney of the house Miguel had built with his own hands. It was impossible to imagine this place as a battlefield, but Elena knew that appearances could be deceiving. That evening, she climbed to the highest point on her property, a rocky outcrop that provided a panoramic view of the surrounding valleys and mountains. This was where she came to think through difficult decisions, where the silence and vastness of the landscape helped put human problems into proper perspective. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the snow and creating deep shadows in the forest below. Elena could see lights twinkling in the distant town, signs of the civilization that existed beyond her mountain sanctuary. Normal people were sitting in warm houses, watching television, planning weekend activities, completely unaware of the war being waged in their midst. Elena envied them their innocence, but she could not share it. She had seen too much, done too much, to ever again live the protected life that federal witness protection would provide. The woman who had killed 3 professional assassins with her bare hands could not simply disappear into suburban anonymity. A sound in the forest below caught her attention. Elena reached for her binoculars and scanned the tree line until she spotted Silver moving through the shadows with her cubs. The mountain lion family had denayed closer to the ranch buildings over the winter, probably attracted by the relative safety Elena's presence provided from other predators. Watching Silver hunt and raise her young had taught Elena important lessons about survival, territory, and the bonds that make life worth defending. Mountain lions were solitary creatures, but they would fight to the death to protect their cubs and their territory. They understood that some things were more important than individual survival. Elena made her decision on that moonlit mountainside, with Silver's pale form moving through the forest below and the weight of 4 generations of family history pressing down on her shoulders. She would not abandon this land, would not trade her identity for safety, would not allow criminals to drive her from the home her ancestors had carved out of the wilderness. If they wanted a war, she would give them one. But it would be fought on her terms, in her territory, using every advantage that the mountain could provide. Elena spent the next 2 days preparing for the battle she knew was coming. But instead of focusing on defensive positions and weapons, she concentrated on the psychological and environmental advantages that had served her so well in previous conflicts. Her first priority was weather. The storm system Agent Chun had mentioned was indeed approaching, bringing the possibility of heavy snow, high winds, and near-zero visibility. These conditions would neutralize many of the attackers' technological advantages, while playing to Elena's superior knowledge of the terrain. Elena had lived through dozens of mountain storms, had learned to navigate by feel and sound when snow made visual reference impossible. Her enemies would be operating blind, dependent on GPS devices and night vision equipment that could be rendered useless by the right conditions. Her second priority was expanding her alliance with the local wildlife. Elena had been leaving food offerings for Silver and her cubs throughout the winter, gradually earning a level of trust that went beyond simple tolerance. Now she needed to deepen that relationship to create the kind of partnership that had existed between her Apache ancestors and the animals they considered spiritual allies. Using techniques her grandmother had taught her, Elena began spending entire nights in the forest, learning to move and communicate in ways that mountain lions would accept. She practiced until she could produce the low rumbling sounds that big cats use for close-range communication, mastered the body language that signified respect and non-aggression, and developed the patience to remain motionless for hours while observing feline behavior. The process required a level of focus and dedication that most people would consider impossible. Elena had to override millions of years of human evolution that identified large predators as mortal threats, replacing instinctive fear with conscious understanding of mountain lion psychology and social structure. By the fourth day, Elena had achieved something unprecedented. She could approach within 20 feet of Silver and her cubs without triggering a defensive reaction. The mountain lions accepted her presence as natural, even beneficial, recognizing her as a guardian of territory they all shared. Elena's third priority was creating confusion and fear among her enemies before they even reached her property. She spent hours hiking to strategic locations along the access routes that led to her ranch, leaving signs and territorial markers that would suggest the presence of an unusually large and aggressive mountain lion population. Scratch marks on trees at heights that would require an enormous cat, piles of bones arranged in patterns that looked ritualistic, and scent markings that combined mountain lion musk with other elements designed to suggest supernatural presence. The goal was to plant seeds of doubt and fear that would grow as the attackers moved deeper into what they would perceive as cursed or haunted territory. Elena's final preparation involved creating false intelligence about her own capabilities and resources. Using radio equipment she had purchased years earlier for emergency communication, she began broadcasting fake conversations that suggested she was coordinating with a large group of armed supporters. The transmissions were designed to be intercepted by anyone monitoring radio frequencies in the area. Elena created fictional characters, gave them military backgrounds and tactical expertise, and had them discuss defensive positions, weapon caches, and coordination with federal law enforcement agencies. By the time the storm arrived on Friday evening, Elena had transformed her ranch from an isolated target into what appeared to be a heavily defended fortress protected by supernatural forces and supported by a network of dangerous allies. The reality was different, but no less formidable. Elena stood alone on her mountain, armed with her grandfather's hunting knife, her knowledge of the terrain, and a partnership with predators that most people would consider impossible. She was outnumbered 12-1, outgunned by military-grade weapons, and facing enemies with professional training and violence. But she was also fighting for something that gave her strength beyond what any training or equipment could provide. This land held the graves of her ancestors, the memories of her marriage, the dreams of her future. Every tree, rock, and stream was part of her identity as completely as her own heartbeat. The snow began falling just after midnight, large flakes that quickly accumulated and reduced visibility to less than 50 feet. Wind howled through the forest, creating a natural camouflage for any sounds Elena might make while moving through her territory. Elena's early warning systems began triggering just before dawn, indicating that vehicles were approaching along the main access road. She watched through binoculars as trucks loaded with armed men struggled through the deepening snow, their headlights barely penetrating the swirling white curtain that had enveloped the mountain. The attackers were well-equipped and disciplined, but they were also operating in alien terrain under conditions that favored the defender. Elena could see them pausing frequently to check GPS devices and radio for instructions, clear signs that they were uncomfortable with the environment they had entered. More importantly, she could see them reacting to the territorial markings she had placed along their route. Several times, the lead vehicle stopped completely while men got out to examine scratch marks or bone arrangements that suggested the presence of large predators. Their body language indicated growing unease, exactly the psychological effect Elena had been hoping to create. As the convoy approached the final turn before reaching Elena's property, she implemented the first phase of her defense. Using a technique Silver had taught her through patient observation, Elena began producing the deep, resonant roar that mountain lions use to claim territory and warn away intruders. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, seeming to come from multiple directions at once and building to a crescendo that vibrated through the ground itself. In the howling wind and swirling snow, it sounded like the voice of the mountain itself, ancient and terrible and utterly hostile to human presence. Elena watched through her binoculars as the convoy came to an abrupt halt. Men poured out of the trucks, weapons raised, and voices shouting over the wind as they tried to identify the source of the sound that had chilled them to their bones. They had come to Elena's mountain expecting to find an isolated woman hiding in her house, waiting to be slaughtered like livestock. Instead, they had entered a realm where the normal rules of civilized warfare no longer applied, where the very land seemed to be alive and hunting them. Elena smiled grimly as she watched their confusion and fear. The real battle was just beginning, but the psychological war had already been won. These men might be professionals, but they were about to face something beyond their training or imagination. A woman who had learned to think like a mountain lion and who was willing to use that knowledge to defend her territory to the death. The storm was intensifying, the wind was rising, and somewhere in the swirling snow, Silver and her cubs were beginning to stalk new prey that had invaded their hunting grounds. Elena Vasquez was no longer fighting alone. The blizzard reached its full fury just as the 12 armed men deployed around Elena's property, their military precision hampered by wind gusts that reached 60 miles per hour and snow so thick that visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. Elena watched from her concealed position as they struggled to maintain formation and communication in conditions that transformed familiar landscape into an alien maze of white confusion. Their leader was a stocky man with facial scars that suggested extensive combat experience. Elena could see him try and coordinate his team through handheld radios, but the storm was creating interference that made reliable communication impossible. The technological advantages they had counted on were being neutralized by the mountain's own defenses. Elena had been monitoring their radio frequencies since their arrival, listening to increasingly frustrated attempts to establish clear command and control. The false intelligence she had broadcast earlier was having its intended effect, with several team members reporting possible contacts with defenders who existed only in Elena's imagination. "Bravo team, report your position." The leader's voice crackled through the static. "Still moving toward the barn," came the reply. "But we've got fresh tracks out here, and they're not from the target. Something big, and there's more than one." Elena smiled grimly. Those tracks belonged to Silver and her cubs, who had been moving through the area all night, drawn by the scent of intruders and the promise of territorial conflict. The mountain lions weren't actively hunting the human invaders yet, but their presence was adding to the atmosphere of menace that Elena had been carefully cultivating. The first casualty came when one of the attackers separated from his partner to investigate what appeared to be a defensive position near Elena's equipment shed. Elena had been tracking his movement for 20 minutes, using the sound of his breathing and the crunch of snow under his boots to maintain contact despite the limited visibility. When he paused to examine what he thought was a sniper's nest, Elena emerged from the storm behind him like a vengeful spirit. Her grandfather's hunting knife found the gap between his helmet and body armor with surgical precision, and he dropped into the snow without making a sound. Elena dragged the body into a nearby ravine, then took his radio and weapon. She now had real-time intelligence on the attacker's movements and communications, a crucial advantage that would only grow more valuable as the battle progressed. "Charlie 3, report status," the leader's voice demanded through the captured radio. Elena waited 30 seconds, then responded in a voice disguised by static and wind noise. "Charlie 3 in position. Negative contact." The deception bought her precious time to relocate before the team leader realized that one of his men was missing. Elena had learned patience from hunting mountain lions, understanding that the most effective predators were those who struck once, then melted away to strike again from an unexpected direction. Her next target was a two-man team attempting to approach the house from the north side. These men were more experienced, maintaining visual contact with each other and checking their surroundings regularly. Elena would need to use different tactics to separate and eliminate them. She began by creating sounds that suggested movement in the forest to their left, subtle noises that could have been wind or wildlife, but occurred with suspicious frequency. One of the men became increasingly focused on the potential threat, turning his attention away from his partner and their assigned sector of responsibility. Elena struck when a distracted man moved 15 feet ahead of his companion to investigate a particular sound. She took him from behind with a chokehold, applying pressure to his carotid artery until he lost consciousness, then finishing him with a knife before his partner realized what was happening. But this time, Elena made a tactical error. As she was dragging the body into concealment, the second man turned and caught a glimpse of movement through the swirling snow. His shout of alarm echoed across the property, immediately followed by automatic weapons fire that shredded the air around Elena's position. Contact north side. Charlie 4 is down. Repeat, Charlie 4 is down. Elena was already moving, using the storm and her intimate knowledge of the terrain to put distance between herself and the aroused defenders. But the element of surprise was gone now, replaced by a deadly game of cat and mouse where one mistake would be fatal. The surviving team members began falling back toward predetermined rally points, their formation becoming more defensive as they realized they were facing an opponent who could strike from any direction. Elena could hear their increasingly tense radio communications as they tried to account for missing teammates and coordinate responses to threats they couldn't see or predict. Alpha Leader, this is Bravo 2. We got something moving in the tree line, but it's not human. Looks like mountain lions, and they're acting aggressive. Elena felt a surge of fierce satisfaction. Silver and her cubs were responding to the territorial intrusion exactly as she had hoped, their natural hunting instincts triggered by the scent of fear and blood that was beginning to permeate the battlefield. Mountain lions were ambush predators, patient and opportunistic, striking only when they had every advantage. The storm, the terrain, and the confused state of the human invaders created perfect hunting conditions for the big cats, and Elena could sense their growing excitement through sounds and movements that only she would recognize. Negative on mountain lions, the team leader's voice snapped through the radio. Maintain focus on the primary target. But Elena could hear the doubt in his voice, the first crack in professional confidence that would eventually spread through his entire team. These men had been trained to fight human opponents in conventional conflicts, not to face an enemy who moved like a wild animal through terrain that seemed actively hostile to their presence. Elena's next attack came from an unexpected direction, above. Using climbing skills developed during decades of tracking mountain lions through rocky terrain, she had positioned herself on a rocky ledge overlooking one of the attacker's defensive positions. The man below was crouched behind a fallen log, scanning the forest through a night vision scope that was largely useless in the heavy snowfall. Elena dropped onto him from 12 feet above, her knife penetrating his skull before he could react to the threat from overhead. 3 down, 9 remaining. But the attackers were adapting to Elena's tactics, pulling their perimeter tighter and maintaining better visual contact with each other. The team leader had also realized that their radios were compromised, switching to hand signals and predetermined movement patterns that Elena couldn't monitor or predict. Elena needed to escalate the psychological pressure before the remaining attackers organized an effective search pattern that would eventually corner her. She began implementing the most dangerous phase of her defense plan, active collaboration with the mountain lions that shared her territory. Using the low, rumbling calls that Silver had taught her to recognize and produce, Elena began communicating with the big cats in their own language. She was calling them to hunt, inviting them to join her in defending territory that belonged to both human and feline residents. Silver's response was immediate and terrifying. Her answering roar echoed through the storm, followed by similar calls from her cubs as the mountain lion family began moving toward the human intruders with predatory intent. What the hell was that? One of the attackers demanded over the radio. Mountain lions, another voice replied, strain evident despite professional training. Big ones, and they're close. Elena could hear the fear beginning to infect their communications, professional discipline giving way to primal anxiety about facing natural predators in their own environment. These men were accustomed to being the apex predators in any conflict, and the realization that they had become prey was devastating to their tactical effectiveness. The mountain lions struck without warning, Silver leading her cubs in a coordinated attack that targeted the most isolated member of the human invasion force. The man's screams echoed across the property for less than 10 seconds before being cut short by sounds that no amount of military training had prepared his teammates to handle. Jesus Christ. Stevens is down. Something's got Stevens. Elena could hear panic spreading through their radio communications as the surviving attackers tried to understand what they were facing. The clean, professional operation they had planned was dissolving into a nightmare of wind, snow, and predators that seemed to materialize from the storm itself. Alpha Leader, we need to abort, one voice pleaded. This isn't what we signed up for. Negative, the team leader replied, but Elena could hear doubt creeping into his voice. We complete the mission. But completing the mission was no longer possible. Elena had successfully transformed a straightforward assassination into a supernatural horror that was destroying the attackers' cohesion and effectiveness. They were no longer hunting her. They were fighting for survival against forces they couldn't understand or counter. Elena's next attack targeted their vehicles. Using explosive devices she had improvised from materials in Miguel's workshop. The detonation of their primary escape route sent flames climbing into the storm-darkened sky and eliminated any possibility of retreat until the weather cleared. Trapped on the mountain with their numbers reduced and their enemies multiplying, the surviving attackers began making desperate decisions. 3 of them attempted to assault Elena's house directly, probably hoping to complete their original mission and find shelter from both the storm and the predators stalking them. Elena was waiting for them in the basement, using the building's layout to channel their approach through predetermined kill zones. She had spent years familiarizing herself with every inch of the house Miguel had built, understanding how sound traveled through its walls and where shadows would provide concealment. The first attacker through the door met Elena's knife in the darkness of the kitchen, dying silently while his partners continued searching the upper floor. Elena used their separation to eliminate the second man as he descended into the basement, then tracked the third through the house until she could strike from behind in the hallway, where she